Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to Coventry University London campus here near Liverpool Street Station for this important discussion, the EU Referendum It's Your Business debate. My name is Callum Morrison. I lead the modules teaching entrepreneurship for the university here. And I'd like to pass over to my colleague, James Bellini, who will be moderating the debate. Thank you, James.
Okay. Colin, many thanks for that, and good afternoon. May I add my own very warm welcome to this UK200Group EU Referendum Debate. I think many commentators have described the vote on the 23rd of June as the most important constitutional decision this country has faced in several generations. If you want to mug up tonight on the European Constitution, here's a bit of it, some of it, and I'm sure our panellists are totally familiar with the nooks and crannies of all that stuff. That's right. Anyway, today we're going to hear the case for both sides of the argument with the accent, as you can see at the top here, the accent on clarity. I see my job, I think, is to give the two viewpoints a fair and balanced hearing, but just important, I want to make sure all of you get the most out of this event as well. We've got some students here in the audience as well, and I hope they'll put their comments and questions when we have time. We do have a little bit of a time problem for obvious reasons, so we'll have to get through at a bit of a lick. Any rules? There are no Chatham House rules here today. Everything is on the record. As you can see, we have cameras, many cameras actually, some from overseas. Proceedings will be streamed live to the many UK200 Group members and their clients. A total altogether, by the way, of over 150,000 SME businesses. They couldn't be here today, and I'll tell them now that in case you lose the line, because we lose that feed at 6 o'clock, there will be a full edited version available for you from next Tuesday. So don't worry that you've missed anything. So, the debate itself starts promptly at 5:24 and closes around about 6 o'clock. We've got some busy people here. You've probably got a division or so later on, have you? Some of you?
Have.
Yeah. That's parliamentary speak for going down the pub, but I'm sure they're busy people, I'm being serious. So to get things going, I'm going to introduce our four panellists and invite them each to give us a very brief overview of their arguments to sort of set their scene, minute, maybe a couple of minutes at the outside, and we'll go from there, okay? And then I'm going to ask you to cast your votes. You're sitting on a big wodge of stuff here. 3 of them are actually voting papers, and you can choose one of them, undecided, remain, or leave. Just hold them up like that. They'll be on the film. And I'll also ask you at the end of our discussion and debate to re-vote again, just to see if any of you become changed, if you like, in your viewpoints. So I hope all of you at least go away a little bit wiser on the issues as well this afternoon. So,
James,
introduce, yeah.
Just before you do, would it be worth, before we do our introductory statements, would it be worth knowing how people are going to leave or remain before we speak?
Fine.
Sorry,
Let's
I'm
do it now.
subverting it already.
Orange for leave, blue for remain, and white for undecided. Hold them up now, please, and hold them up for a few moments because they'll be on the film.
On this basis,
we need to get the cameras on you. All the people in the front row are undecided.
8 leaves, 9 leaves, 10 leaves.
Yeah, 10.
Okay. Would it be fair to say, panellists, that at the moment there's quite a large proportion in favour of remain? That would be a fair comment. But as I say, we're here to look at both sides of this subject as well. So, introduce very briefly, our panellists. On the far left of the platform, arguing the case for the UK to continue its membership of the European Union. She's Deputy Director of the campaign group Britain Stronger in Europe, Lucy Thomas. You're very welcome, Lucy. Alongside her, she served in the House of Commons as a Labour MP for almost 20 years. Holding both senior cabinet posts and shadow cabinet posts. She's now MP for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford. Yvette Cooper, Yvette. And this side of the platform ranged against them on the Leave side of the debate. First, after a spell in the world of business, he entered Parliament in 1987, I think, and went on to hold numerous roles in the Conservative Party, both in and out of office. He's MP for Halton Price and Howden, David Davis. And Finally also backing the Leave campaign, and believe it or not, also spent a few years in the corporate world before becoming a Conservative MP in the 2005 general election. He is, of course, widely known for many of us for his defection from the Conservatives in 2014 and his subsequent by-election victory for UKIP in Clacton, Douglas Carswell. Douglas, hi. Okay, we'll go from left to right to make it easy for the cameras. Lucy Thomas, can you perhaps give us a bit of your time to tell us why we should vote Remain?
Certainly. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much all for being here and for still wanting to hear this argument. We're sort of 3 months in now and you still want to hear us going for it, so that's great. I like the fact that this is a campaign for clarity. Certainly you will have heard lots of things from both sides of the argument, so I will endeavour to be clear as I can be with this very knotty issue. For me, I think it's really important to set out from the beginning, this decision is not about whether we join the EU or indeed whether the EU is perfect at everything it does. It is about whether we remain as part of the EU with all of the benefits that that brings. And that is as part of the world's largest free trade single market, where almost half of our exports go, with 500 million consumers, allowing our businesses to trade freely, linked to around 3 million jobs in the UK, lower prices in the shops, huge amount of investment. And whether we decide to walk away from all of that with absolutely no certainty over what that deal outside would look like. It'll be interesting to hear from David and Douglas tonight whether they can guarantee a particular model of out. We've heard Norway, we've heard Switzerland, Canada, Albania a couple of weeks ago from Michael Gove, so it'll be interesting to hear. The latest from Boris, confirmed today, and Michael Gove over the weekend, was that they want to leave the single market. Now, to me, that is a recipe for risking jobs, for increasing prices, for hugely affecting our economy. And I fear genuinely what would happen were we to leave, what would happen to our businesses were they to face tariffs and other barriers, as they would. We have to be clear, if we were to trade under the World Trade Organization rules, as Pascal Lamy, the former head of the WTO, said, you would be facing tariffs, your businesses would be affected, and it would be a crazy model to follow. So for me, the case is incredibly clear. As I say, the EU is absolutely not perfect. I will not stand up here and suggest that it is. There are lots of things that can be made better. But you make it better by staying in, by reforming it. We have so many benefits as being part of the EU, and I think leaving would be a huge leap into the unknown.
Yvette, thank you. Lucy, thank you very much. Yvette.
Like Lucy, I think we need to remain. The reason is because I think Britain is a great country and a small island that punches above our weight, not because of our industrial past or because of our colonial history, but because we have a pivotal position in so many of the important networks across the planet. Uniquely, Britain is a member of NATO, of the Commonwealth, of the Five Eyes intelligence, and also, as well, not just the UN Security Council, but of the European Union. And it's that pivotal role which strengthens our global influence, our power, our security, our trade, and our economic opportunity. And that is what makes us Britain. On security, it's why the Met Commissioner, it's why top police chiefs, it's why the former heads of MI5 and MI6, it's why the head of NATO and our main military allies all say that those EU networks for security, cooperation, for intelligence, and for criminal cooperation are all immensely important. They say we're stronger and safer in, and I don't think we should make their jobs harder by pulling out. On the economy, it's why the IMF, the Treasury, the Bank of England, the OECD, the National Institute, the LSE, the CBI, the TUC all say our economy would be heavily hit if we pulled out. And the only senior economist who is backing the Leave campaign, Sir Patrick Minford, has also said that our manufacturing would be decimated if we pulled out. Now, I don't think we should be putting our jobs and livelihoods and people's businesses at risk by this uncertain leap into the dark. The Leave campaign can't tell us what the trade deal will be. That'll be partly because they disagree. But they do promise us that somehow trade will be better if we pull out. Well, that is a fantasy land, because if we are outside the single market, the fact is that the costs of trade will be higher, particularly for our services. And other major countries that they say that we can trade with instead, maybe it's US, maybe it's China, maybe it's India, all of those countries have said they would rather trade with us within the EU rather than without. And whatever happens in the long run, no one doubts that there will be a short-term shock to the economy with the uncertainty, hits to investment and the currency as a result of the decision. The EU is not perfect, Lucy's right. And there are some arguments that we lose. Actually, most of them we win. And I think there should be a lot more reforms in future, and we should be in there arguing for them. But Britain's way has never been to flounce out in the name of some false promise or fantasy. We're practical. We roll up our sleeves, we get things done, we get things sorted out. And that means in the modern global world, in the modern threats that we face in the modern global economy, that means working together. And that is why I believe we are stronger and better off in.
Thank you for that. Going to hand the microphone now to Douglas, please.
Good afternoon. If there was a single word I would use to explain why I think we should leave the European Union, it's obsolete. The European Union is obsolete. When we joined what was to become the European Union all those years ago, it was sold to us as an economic proposition. Yes, they said we might lose a bit of self-government, but it would make us more prosperous. Look across the channel today. Who now seriously believes that? It's not just a question of what's happening to the Eurozone, although that somewhat hit the credibility of those who 20 years ago were saying we would face ruin if we didn't adopt the euro. It's not stopped the same grandees at the IMF and the CBI and elsewhere rolling out the same arguments in favour of continued membership of the EU. But when we joined all those years ago, the European Union accounted for nearly 40% of world output. Nearly 40% of everything that was made and produced in the world was made in Europe. Today it's down to 22%. By the mid-2020s, it's forecast to be 15%. It's a precipitous decline. And it's countries in the single market, countries in the European single market, that are performing worst in global terms. And it's not a coincidence. Since 2007, the output of China has grown fourfold. India has doubled. Even Ethiopia has doubled. In the single market and in the Eurozone, the only indices that have grown by that amount are those that measure debt and unemployment. How much worse does it have to get before we realize that the world's only declining trade bloc is declining because it's arranged a certain way? The European Union is obsolete precisely because it's arranged as a dirigiste, top-down throwback to the 1950s. We now live in a world where proximity to markets has never mattered less. A business in my constituency can trade as easily with Christchurch on the south coast as it can with Christchurch in New Zealand. Proximity to markets matters less than ever. Only 6% of all UK firms trade with the European Union, and yet we're invited to have 100% blanket compliance with every rule and regulation that they make.
Can we wind it up, Douglas?
If we leave, we can have tariff-free access to the whole of Europe, which already exists from Iceland through to Turkey. If we leave, we can have controlled immigration, but not, I repeat, not close our borders. The benefits of labour mobility have made this country what it is, have made London what it is. We can have a rational, sensible migration policy that allows us to continue to attract the brightest and the best from around the world. We can do that if we take back control.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for that. And finally, David Davis. David.
Thank you. Some time ago, I was the Europe Minister for the last Conservative government. I spent all my time over nearly 5 years negotiating with the European Union. And for the 20 years since then, including then, I have hoped, against hope, that we would see reform. And every time we looked for reform, every time we tried to decentralise, it centralised. Every time we tried to reduce how intrusive it was, it became more intrusive. Every reform actually ended up in the reverse of what we were intended. So what I want to see is control of my country back. And the primary reason is not initially about business. The primary reason is about democracy. This, unfortunately, is an anti-democratic organisation. The people as widespread as Jean-Claude Juncker down to Dimitri Avramopoulos, President down to Commissioner, have said, in effect, don't listen to the voters. When we make our policies, we do not pay attention to the voters. Now, that may not matter, you think, to anybody but a politician. But look at the consequence of that. That's why we got the Greece tragedy. You know, with a quarter of an economy destroyed, public services shattered, hospitals closed, doctors have to leave the country, infant mortality up, the hopes and aspirations of a whole generation, 60% of young Greeks destroyed. And not just Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, where last week there was a survey, and in the home of Europe, in where the Treaty of Rome was written, 48% of Italians say if they had a referendum, they'd vote to leave today. So it's a destructive effect of having this oligarchic operation in place. Now, Douglas has talked about the economy, so I won't stay with it very long, but I'll say something quite simple. For the first 20 years of our membership, the common market actually worked rather well. We were inside a tariff barrier, and it delivered us much greater exports by comparison with our non-European competitors. Since 1993, since the end of the Uruguay round, since the reduction of tariff barriers, since the onset of the single market, which is really a unified regulatory zone, that has not been true. We have done worse rather than better than our competitors around the world. That's why our exports to Europe have gone from 61%, properly calculated, about a decade ago, to 41% now. Our emphasis has gone to the global market. That's where our future is. And we will hear that it's impossible to do this negotiation. You've heard from the European establishment, that's Lagarde and Lamy, and of course our own Prime Minister, that we can't do a negotiation with them. Well, I actually have negotiated with them for 5 years, and this is all nonsense. You normally have this somewhat Latin hysteria at the beginning of the negotiation, and eventually you get a deal, and there are very, very strong reasons why the most important statesmen in Europe will give us a deal which is as good as the one we have today. But more important than that, it will open up free markets around the world. And even listening to Obama a couple of weeks ago, he clearly did not understand his own free trade negotiating process, because his country, far from being a queue, or a line as they would really say in America, far from being a queue, 8 negotiations were completed inside 3 years in the last couple of years. So there's plenty to win out there. There's a great economic future out there, and at the same time, we can improve our security. We've heard from lots of generals saying we can't, and then we've heard from lots of other generals saying we can. We've heard from heads of MI6, still on government payrolls, saying we can't. We've heard from Richard Dearlove, the greatest operational head of MI6 in modern times, saying Europe actually makes our security much worse. So it's a good future ahead of us. Yvette listed for you NATO, UN Security Council, leading Commonwealth member, G7 member. We owe none of those posts to being in the European Union. We owe it to our history and our success as a nation, and we should grasp that and look to a global world.
Thank you, David. Okay, hand it to the floor. Just stick a hand up if you've got an issue or a comment, and we'll go from there. We'll get a roving microphone to you. If you do want to put a question or a point, stand up if you could. Tell us who you are and the organisation you're with. Okay, so while you're thinking about those issues, just want to put a quick question to all 4 of you. You don't have to answer all of you. Maybe just each pair could take a point. But to me, as standing back with my constitutional interests here, is there not a major risk in this campaign that there'll be a huge mismatch in the issues that are argued? On the one side, it seems to be a lot about sovereignty. On the other, about all these economic numbers about being £4,300 worse off by 2030. I mean, Yvette, do you want to take that?
I mean, I think
Mismatch.
Yeah, the issue is about sovereignty. In the end, we are a sovereign country. The British Parliament could decide to pull out of the European Union at any time. We have the sovereignty to do that, just as we would have the sovereignty to pull out of NATO. But we give up some of our sovereignty by being part of NATO, and we have an obligation actually to go to war if other countries within NATO are threatened as a result. But we do that because it makes us safer. So it's the same thing, I think, on Europe, that yes, we do get into an agreement with other countries because it makes us better off. And the reason I think they are linked is because actually we are agreeing to sign up to deals with other countries between democratically elected governments. And that's where I disagree with both Douglas and David that somehow this is the end of democracy, because actually it's democratically elected governments having a row with each other or having a disagreement with each other, but we've got a framework to be able to do so. But the consequence of it, in the end, is about jobs. It is about trade, and that is about the figures. It is about how it impacts on households, how it impacts on people's pockets and people's jobs.
Douglas, shaking your head violently there.
This is about both sovereignty and about being better off economically. The argument is that we should take back control, not just take back control over lawmaking, but also take back control over the £350 million every week that we hand over to Brussels. Think about that, £350 million a week. That's 19.2 billion a year divided by the 52 weeks that there are. If we were to take back control of that money, think of what we could do with that money. We could improve the NHS. We could possibly afford tax cuts. To put that in context, the amount of money we pay the EU in context, over the last Parliament, we gave net contributions to the EU, net contributions, not gross contributions, of 42 billion in the last Parliament. And yet the entire value of the austerity of the last Parliament was 36 billion. In other words, that amount that we pay to the EU would negate the need for an austerity budget. It's an enormous amount of money. If we take back control, we will be better off materially too.
David, do you want to come back?
Yes, just very quickly, you asked about mismatch. Actually, they're not separate. The point I made about Greece, it's the lack of a democratic accountability that allows Greece to happen. But the title of this debate is clarity, is it not? And one of the things that happens all the time with the Remain campaign is they conflate different meanings of sovereignty. Sovereignty when dealing with NATO, it's a straight deal. It's a one-line deal. Somebody else gets invaded, we defend them. The sovereignty when it's dealing with the European Union is more fine print than you could cover the whole of the continent with, because you don't know what you're signing up for. Yesterday, the European Court said, against 27 nations objecting, by the way, said, we're now going to take control of when you deport people abroad outside the European Union. Nobody agreed to that. That's what the loss of sovereignty is about.
Okay. Lucy, do you want to come back in? Have a few seconds, balance of time?
I would. I think this idea of control, it's fascinating that actually, to me, you lose control by leaving, because you lose control over all the rules which are still going to affect you. If you want to continue to export almost half of everything, which we do within the single market, you're going to have to still comply with those rules with zero say, because you're not sitting around the table anymore. And this £350 million a week, you are called the Campaign for Clarity. Let's be clear, Douglas, the UK Statistics Authority has twice told the Vote Leave campaign that that is a misleading figure because it doesn't take account of our rebate. And I just think it is utterly shocking, really, to continue to use it when we never send £350 million a week to Brussels, because we don't send the rebate. It's much more like 170 or 190. So I think if we're going to be honest and a fact-based debate, I think we should start with honesty about figures.
Douglas?
If you're going to say that it's okay because we're only handing over 190 million a week, great, good luck with that. I would take the view that actually it's entirely honest to say we're handing over control of 350, precisely because the rebate is in the hands of Brussels. We're handing over control over that money. Now, how much we get back in terms of the rebate and what they might spend it on, that's not for us to decide. If we vote to leave, we take back control over that 350. That's entirely honest and entirely factual.
Okay,
Douglas,
quick
hang
comment,
on.
I'll open
That
up
not
the floor.
only is actually it been decided by European governments arguing together and coming to a deal, but also we get back far more than we put in terms of trade. The hit to our economy would be around £2 billion a week, and the impact of our trade as a result of that. So, yeah, we are part of the European Union. Yeah, that means we put something in, but we get so much more back, and that is what you would put at risk by pulling out.
Okay, let's move on then to the subject matter that's going to be of great interest to the people watching online and, of course, in the theatre here today, because many of you are from the SME community. And you send in loads and loads of questions, far too many to cover off today in advance of this event. But a couple of them are to do with SMEs and how you will fare in or out of the European Union. I'll just conflate these two, if I may. One question. Many SMEs can't find the skills they need to do the work they have, so freedom movement of people is important. And I'll put together with that, our survey showed that the number one issue for SMEs is growth. What impact will the decision to leave or stay have on our growth prospects? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah.
Go on.
You're absolutely right. Being able to attract workers with the right skills is very, very important. So what on earth are we doing with this insane system of immigration that means we can't attract the brightest and the best from around the world? In order to try to meet Theresa May's targets, we're having to say no to doctors from India, to software engineers from Singapore, but we can't say no to people without the skills we need from countries in Eastern Europe with whom we have no historic association. If we were to vote to leave, we could have a rational immigration system that attracted the brightest and the best. They have it in Australia. It's a points-based, skills-based immigration system. Instead of being able to draw labour simply from Europe, we could be a global magnet for the brightest and the best.
Comment from the Remain side?
I think, look, as any business knows, it is much more bureaucratic to recruit from outside Europe than it is to recruit from inside Europe. So I think there would be an impact, whatever the migration arrangements were, on our recruitment and on the ease of recruitment. I think actually there are reforms. Personally, I think there are reforms that are needed to the way in which free movement works. But I think in the end, the promise from the Leave campaign that somehow pulling out is going to solve migration, there's also a lot of false promise in that as well, because I think in practice the arrangements around free movement will depend on whatever the trade deal is. And at the moment, the price of having full access to the single market from France and Germany is to have the same arrangements around free movement as well. So I tend to think that there's a lot of misinformation about this. In practice, the two things would be closely linked together. But what you could be clear about is actually if you switch everything to the same migration arrangements we have for outside Europe, then that would be far more bureaucratic when it comes to recruitment.
David.
Let me deal with the growth issue and this point about the free trade deal with Europe. If you go outside there and you count the cars going past, and you look for the Audis, BMWs, Mercedes, and Volkswagens, they're the one with the smoke trail, you'll see 30% of the cars sold in Britain today are from Germany. And that's not including the ones where German subsidiaries are in other countries. Apart from agriculture, the industry that will be hit hardest by a world trade deal operation is cars, 10%. 26 billion euros of German cars come here. So if I were negotiating the day after the Brexit decision, I wouldn't go to Brussels. I'd go to Berlin. I'd get the most powerful person in Europe, the most powerful person in every sense in Europe, and say, Angela, I want your cars to have free access to my country. And I want it because we are the second biggest, fastest growing car market in Europe. You want it too. But we can only have that if we have a proper deal. If you have a World Trade Organization deal, the default option, you are the biggest loser, not us. And that's how the negotiation would go. And you start with hysteria in the first few days, and it then becomes more and more about individual national interest, particularly when there are both French and German elections in the negotiating period. Free trade, let me give you one example. Europe did a free trade deal with Singapore not that long ago. It took 70 months. Why did it take 70 months? With all this 28 nation power? Because they had to meet the interests of 28 nations. They got confused between the rights of every single country. And it took 70 months. That's why it takes the European Union twice as long as any other organization to make a deal. And in India, it's never made a deal. And in America, it's now stalling that deal too. We will be faster in making deals that are more in our interest outside the Union than in. So growth will be up, not down.
Thanks a lot for that. I know one or two of our student delegates are burning to join in this debate. Can we get a microphone? Yeah, if you don't mind standing up, here's the mic. Let us know who you are and, well, presumably if you're a student, what you're studying would be a good idea.
Hi, my name is Andrea Cardi. I'm a student of Calc, Coventry University London campus. And my question is, I like to think of the economy as a business, and in a business, cash is king. Every day, the city of London receives trillions in cash flow. In the panel's opinion, do you believe that the cash flow will continue if Britain leaves the EU?
Okay. Going out bad for the city, in a nutshell, yes or no?
Yes, horrendously bad in a nutshell. I think one thing, we've talked a lot about goods and free trade deals and so on, but actually let's think about 80% of our economy, which is services. And the fact that we currently have free trade in services, yes, the single market in services is not complete, but one thing in particular for the City of London is the single financial passport, which allows our banks and financial services to trade across the EU. And there are no countries outside the EU which currently have access to that. And so I think it's highly unlikely that France and Germany are going to say, actually, here you go, guys, you carry on doing that. I think they are going to lap up all of our banks who have already said that they are looking at premises on the continent in order to be ready to move were they to have to. As an example, all the Swiss banks, UBS and others, have their subsidiaries here in London in order to access that passport. And I simply don't believe that we would continue to have that. And so to put some numbers on that, PwC, for example, have looked at the overall impact on the economy of leaving and said that it would cost the UK 100 billion and 950,000 jobs lost by 2020. And that would include many in the city, but also around the country, because financial services jobs aren't only in the city. So I think it's hugely important to factor in that, not just financial services, but services as a whole.
Douglas, fate of the city.
When I was working in the city in financial services, fund management, I was working for the European division of a fund management business 20 years ago. And exactly the same arguments were wheeled out to say why we needed to join the euro. Many of the same people, indeed, are making precisely the same arguments. I can't help noticing that it's Peter Mandelson and Goldman Sachs and the same politicians like Ken Clarke making precisely the same arguments. But I'm afraid it will not do to assert it. They claim that we need to be in the European Union to have passporting rights. Switzerland has had passporting rights since 1991 through a treaty. The fact that many Swiss banks happen to be in the City of London is because in the City of London they can hire the brightest and the best from around the world. If we remain in the European Union, we will be subject to a whole host of regulations and restrictions that are already coming down the line. Look at the insurance regulations. The truth is that when it comes to financial service regulation, we're seeing a process of global convergence around the world. Look at, for example, Basel III. It happens not to be in the European Union. Indeed, much of this global convergence is not happening at a European Union level. If we're outside the European Union, we can be part of that process of global financial regulatory convergence with an enormous say. We can have a British representative who has the interests of the city at heart. At the moment, we have to enter into negotiations with 1/28th share in a Eurocrat. And often, let's be clear about it, often many of the regulations that Brussels has drawn up not only fail to understand the correlation between risk and reward that is central to any system of regulation of financial services, they're often actually drawn up by people who have a hostility towards the City of London. We're better off by leaving and insulating ourselves from that threat and taking back control.
But the problem
point,
is,
Yvette, yeah.
all the references Switzerland or to Norway, is a lot of these countries end up having to abide by all of the same EU rules. They just don't get any say in what they are. They just can't argue with other European countries to get the best possible deal for Norwegian industry or finance, for Swiss industry or finance. They just have to take what they're given. And I just think there is a huge fallacy in David's argument that somehow, because of pressure from a few businesses in Germany and France, they're going to all roll over and give us a better trade deal than they have got at the moment. The idea that the French and German government, the governments right across Europe, would suddenly say, we've got elections coming up, well, we're going to say, yeah, you, Britain, you've just decided to leave, you can have a better deal, you can pay in less than we do, you can have better trade terms than we do, you can ditch all the regulations that you don't like and just keep the ones that you do like, you can have a much better deal than any of us have got, and we'll pay the price within Europe. It is just not going to happen. Be realistic and honest about the realities facing other European countries. They will give us a worse deal. And that is why countries across the globe, other countries that we want to trade more with, whether it is India, China, US, other allies across the globe, are saying we are mad to pull out because we've got the best deal going. If we want to improve that deal, we should be in there arguing to improve that deal, arguing to reform it, arguing to change it. If we pull out, we won't have a say on what that detail of that deal is.
Okay, here's a viewpoint then from another member of the international community as well as the faculty of this university.
Good afternoon. My name is Diana, and I'm MBA Global Business student here in Coventry University London campus. And I have an economic question. If Britain withdraws from the EU, do you expect the cost of goods imported from abroad and consumed by the average British person to fall or to rise?
Lucy, you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, as with lots of this stuff, a lot of it depends on what kind of a deal we would get. But if you take Boris's latest version of out, which is to leave the single market, you then sort of revert back to WTO tariffs until you've negotiated them away. I'm sure David and Douglas will say we'll just negotiated them all overnight and it'll be absolutely fine. But if that doesn't happen, which I think is more likely, cars, for example, would have tariffs of 10% on them. Commercial vehicles, passenger vehicles, very much like Boris's bus, which he's touring the country in today, would go up by 12%. So his bus would be £56,000 more expensive, for example. Then you look at things like the cost of flights, which have come down by 40% because we're in the EU, because of that increased competition with the EU basically smashing open markets and allowing low-cost carriers to fly. And EasyJet have been very clear that those costs would go up were we to leave because there would be increased regulatory burdens. And there could even be questions over whether UK airlines could operate in between European countries, not taking off from in the UK and starting from other places. So, there is uncertainty. We don't know precisely what it would look like, but until and unless we can negotiate away tariffs, there would be significant cost increases. And other foodstuffs, beef and lamb and other things are particularly prohibitively tariff-laden in deals that Canada has, for example, and also Albania, the one that Michael Gove talked about. So there are some products which would be hugely hard hit. Can I just very quickly come back on the euro thing, because I just think it's a totally unfair smear to just say they were all in favour of joining the euro. Gordon Brown today gave a speech. Who stopped us from going into the euro? Gordon Brown, Ed Balls, I'm sure Yvette also didn't want us to join the euro. So let's be honest.
Actually,
David, you were there, right?
When she's finished, yeah, I'll answer that.
Okay, can we get a response then from the Leave side on these comments? Douglas.
Let me just deal with this. Gordon Brown stopped us going in the euro. Actually, Ken Clarke, believe it or not, stopped us going in the euro in the first instance.
You shouldn't say that he's the one.
Let me finish the argument. Ken Clarke was the Chancellor at the time. The government of the day would not go into the euro. Ken would have liked to, but he would not go into the euro. Similarly, Schengen was negotiated by the government of the day. I was there at all the meetings for these. So Gordon Brown didn't stop anything. He simply didn't change the policy he inherited. I also want just to finish with an issue I wasn't allowed to come in on earlier. This argument about whether people will do a deal with you, they do a deal with you in national terms for the same reasons they do a deal with you in business terms. They do a deal if it's in their own interest. What's been presumed by the Remain campaign over and over again is that somehow hysteria is going to take over international negotiation. Of course, before we leave, if they don't want us to leave, they will make the most blood-curdling comments about what will happen. The moment we're through that point, they will make a decision as to what's in their interest. And at the moment, what they do is in their interest, but it isn't always in ours. And let's pick up this services issue. I mean, the idea that we have free trade in services in Europe is a interesting fiction. But look at what happens when they go and do free trade deals abroad. In the 20 not very important free trade deals that the European Union has done so far, services, the most important part of our economy, only are even mentioned in 6 of them. That's how much benefit we get from the European Union in terms of their negotiating capacity and their approach. Now, just to come back on cost of living, 2 things. Stuart Rose, the leader of the Remain campaign, let it out in his first appearance in Parliament when he said actually wages would go up if we left the European Union. That's the first thing he said. The second thing, the best economic estimates, House of Commons estimates, in fact, not ours, not theirs, indicate that in the event of Brexit, with no negotiations being done at all, nothing at all, which is an illusion, but with nothing being done at all, a number of things will come down in price. Clothes will come down in price, shoes, and a number of other imported issues that come through the common external tariff barrier. And the range of reductions is between 12 and 17%. Now, I happen to think that that's a sort of artificial number because it assumes no negotiation. But there will be a negotiation, and everybody will agree what's in their own interest, their own best interest. And in our case, the British government, negotiating on behalf of the British people, will go for the deal which gives the lowest cost of living.
Quick thought, Douglas? The clock is very much against us. I'm trying to pack in a couple more.
Please don't take my word for it. Take the word of one of the leading Remain campaigners, Lord Ashdown. Lord Ashdown admitted that if we leave, food would be cheaper. Now, he presented this as somehow a bad thing. But, you know, many of the folk that I represent in Clacton would find cheaper food and higher wages, as Lord Rose identified, as a good thing. If you look at the European Union from the sort of perspective of someone who flies club class at someone else's expense, and the European Union, I believe, is created largely by and for such people, you see those trifling concerns as a bad thing. But I think cheaper food, higher wages, and lower cost of living would not only come about as a consequence of us leaving the European Union, the Remain campaign has admitted as much too.
Okay, thanks for that. As I say, the clock's ticking away. Is that a question up there? Yeah, can we get a microphone to them? We've got two now. They're all coming out of the woodwork. Both of them. That poor fella's had his hand up for a long time. And I'll take both questions, and if there's some common territory, then we can answer that and then move to the close. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Angelo Boccato. I'm a freelance journalist. I would like to ask two questions to David Davis and Douglas Carswell. I'll be very synthetic given the time. One is on the deal issue. Given the fact that 2 weeks ago, German legislator Angela Merkel government expressed the intent not to give any special treatment to Britain.
Just try and summarise the question, sir.
And so how is it possible to expect a positive deal? And the other thing is what's going to happen in a Brexit scenario, not just to the EU citizen living and working in the UK, but also to the 2 million British citizen living and working in the EU?
Okay. Final microphone over to this young fellow at the back. And there might be some common ground. You never know. And then I'll ask you briefly to summarise for 30, 40 seconds, and then we'll close, yeah?
Hi, my name is Tim. Today I went to Gordon Brown's lecture. He suggests one of the interesting things is the balance between the control and the cooperation. Basically, he mentioned that if the Britain doesn't want to integrate into the EU superstate, they can against it, while they can keep the cooperation such as business, security, social security, economic, political cooperation with them. So I'm wondering the Brexit, what would happen? Is it right to break the balance? Yeah.
Thanks for that. Answer however you can, Lucy, and then deal with some of those issues. I think they seem to be also about sovereignty in a globalised world, don't they?
Yeah. I think just coming back very quickly on prices and food prices, the NFU have been clear that food prices would go up. And so you could argue that that's in their interest, but they very much don't want to. But to not be dragged into things, and you may hear about this 5 presidents report, which Vote Leave and others talk about, which is a report about the integration of the Eurozone. And actually, it's in our interests that the Eurozone is successful and that the EU economy is successful, but we're never going to be dragged into that. This report refers only to the Eurozone. And I think so we've got to be clear that we have the best of all possible worlds with our relationship.
Okay. Let's go to the Leave campaign now for a comment on that. Is it going to be you, Douglas? Toss a coin.
What would other countries make of us leaving the EU? Well, their politicians may be annoyed, but their businesses and their manufacturers would carry on as before. Just think this through. Imagine that we were to leave the European Union at midnight tonight. There are no tariffs. There is no restraint. There is no restriction. It's not as though we would have to negotiate to get rid of tariffs. There are no tariffs. It's not as though we would have to enter into complex, detailed negotiations to remove restraint. Already today, there is tariff-free trade from Iceland to Turkey. The only two countries in the European continent that are not given tariff-free access are Russia and Belarus. Do you seriously imagine that the fifth largest economy in the world, Germany's largest export market, is going to be not given as favorable trade terms as Iceland or Turkey? It's inconceivable. The final question was about what sort of relationship we could have if we remain, I guess the word is sort of semi-detached. Well, part of the Remain campaign is pitching that things aren't so bad because we're out of the worst of it. We're not in Schengen. We're not in the euro. Well, think through the logic of it. Are we really saying that the best bit about our relationship with the EU is that we're not involved? Think that through to its logical conclusion. Maybe we would be better off if we voted to leave, and then we could have the sort of relationship with the EU that we want from outside. If we voted to leave and left at midnight tonight, there would still be 27 other countries with whom we would want good relationships. There would still be a need to facilitate the free movement of goods and services. There would still be the need to cooperate over environmental issues in the North Sea. But we might actually be able to elect a government that could do that, rather than a succession of ministers and governments with endlessly pathetic excuses about we never getting the sorts of changes and reforms that we need. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, members of the panel. I know you're pushed for time. I just want to ask you to close very, very briefly with a thought. It's not particularly about some of the issues we've heard today, but for all of us, it's quite a complex package, this. So on the 23rd of June, when millions of pencils hover over that ballot voting paper, is there, in your view, going to be a crunch issue? Could there be a crunch issue that will actually make people do a particular thing? Who wants to start? Yvette.
In the end, I think it would just be a huge, huge risk, huge leap into the unknown in order to leave. You've got Douglas and David somehow promising you something that all of the European governments are saying is not true. They're making promises about deals that are going to be done, about tariffs that we're going to have no tariffs, but they are going to let us have back all of our contributions, and they're going to let us ditch all the same rules. Everybody else who has no tariffs signs up to the same rules and also contributes. And somehow we, Britain, are going to get a better deal than all of that, just on the basis of the word of people like Douglas and David who are not involved. I just think it's a massive leap into the dark. And that, in the end, I think is what will have people have in their minds when they go to the polling booth and they're finally thinking about it is, actually, can I really take the risk? And I think the other thing that will really decide people is, actually, this is not just about the risk for me, it's about my kids' future. In the end, when the world is changing and when global partnerships and relationships matter more than everything else, am I really going to put my kids' future at risk with this kind of leap? And that's why I think, and I hope, people won't vote leave, they'll vote to remain.
Crunch issue, Lucy?
Yeah, I think much like Yvette, we know what we have today, and as I say, it's not perfect, but this is, it's about the future of our country. It's about whether we're stronger and safer. We haven't got onto the intelligence sharing and data and DNA databases, Europol, all those things. You know, we currently have so much better cooperation with the EU, keeping our streets safer and dealing with other global challenges like climate change too. You know, we sit around the table. It is British to be part of something bigger, to be open and outward looking and work together with our neighbours and friends. We don't turn our back, and I think when people are making that decision, that is also what they will think about. Yes, it will be about what is best for me, my family, my job, and my future generations, my children, and so on. But it will also be, what kind of a country do we want to be? Are we open and outward looking? Do we play our full role and take our seat at the top table? Or do we turn our back and shut ourselves off? And I very much hope that people will agree with us that we are far better and stronger and safer by doing that, by playing our full role and being part of the EU.
Thanks very much for that. Douglas, final thought?
I am increasingly confident that we're going to win this. And the reason is because I think people recognise that we face enormous economic, technological and demographic challenges. We face enormous challenges in the future. By remaining part of a failing Union a failing project, we're not in a position to respond to those. The safer thing to do is to take back control. The European Union can't control its borders. It can't control its currency. It hasn't even got to grips with the Greek debt crisis. The safer thing for us to do is to take back control. And as their pencil hovers above the ballot paper, they will have it in their mind that for 8 weeks, the Remain campaign has had the opportunity to make a positive vision of what Europe could be. And has it done so? No. It's tried to patronize and to scare them. It has conjured up ridiculous headlines in the Daily Mail about war and genocide and collapse in society if we don't vote to Remain. The Remain campaign counted upon people signing up to David Cameron's New Deal. It turned out to be a damn squib. They counted on people being intimidated into voting the way they wanted. It turns out that people resent ministers talking down Britain. I think people will vote to leave, and I think we'll be a better, happier, more prosperous country for it.
Okay, David, final thought. I think what was back in my mind there was the sort of SMP syndrome in their referendum, where we thought it was going that way or that way, but maybe how many of them got into that ballot box and thought, oh, I don't know, a bit risky this, and took the easy option?
No, I think actually in the SNP what happened was a lot of people were afraid to say they're in favour of union. In a way, the unfashionable starting point in this was Brexit. Now it's going the other way somewhat. That's why the gap between the phone ballots and the online ballots are narrowing. But our opponents in this, the Leave campaign, sorry, the Remain campaign, nearly, the Remain campaign have used this phrase any number of times, a leap in the dark. That phrase was first ever used in British politics by Lord Derby, I think it was, in 1865, about the 1865 Reform Act, when we started the democracy that has actually made us what we are today. That was a leap in the dark. It was a change from a broken down system that didn't work, that was propping up the establishment but not helping the ordinary person. Becomes rather reminiscent, doesn't it, of the current European system. And we have held out for us this European membership as somehow a safe option. This organisation that can do such harm, as I talked about at the beginning, to Greece, that has actually caused a schism right across the continent between the North and the South, that has, in its foreign policy, caused or exacerbated problems, in its migration policy, in its border control, has exacerbated problems, in its financial policy, has exacerbated problems, and we've probably got another banking or financial crisis coming in the next few years. That's supposed to be the safe option. Now, as Douglas said, we're in a transforming world in which distance is shrinking for the whole globe, not just across the channel, for the whole globe, where information technology is altering the nature of the products we sell. And in that, we have a fabulous advantage. Above the points that actually Yvette listed, the being the G7, being on the UN Security Council, being a leading member of the Commonwealth, above that we have one other thing which we're using at the moment. It's the English language. It's the dominant language of engineering, science, physics, medicine, of the internet, of media, of international law and international commerce. If any country, let alone the 5th biggest country in the world, if any country is able to stand up and make an outstanding success of acting on its own, it's Great Britain. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Okay, I said there'd be a revote, so get those big cards and we'll see how you are thinking. It's not scientific, this, I know, and there's no electoral commission or whatever looking after it, but if you could all raise them in terms of your decision and just hold them up so that they could be captured by the cameras. Would it be fair to say, panellists, that there's been a bit of movement towards the leaves?
I think there are many more Remains, actually, as well. It's the undecideds that have disappeared.
You were the one that asked for the vote at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think you could count it. I think Lucy took a photo.
2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 19. There were 10,
doubled.
They're now 19.
Yeah, right. There we are.
Yeah, and you've got far more Remains as well, I'm afraid. So all the undecideds, at least the undecideds, have listened and come to a decision.
Yeah, ours.
Politicians, don't you love them?
That's clarity for you.
Anyway, it just remains for me, with no pun intended there, to thank our panellists for giving up their valuable time this afternoon. Lucy Thomas, Yvette Cooper, David Davis, and of course Douglas Carswell. Thanks for your insights, thanks for joining in, and I suppose in some respects, good luck to you all on the 23rd of next month. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over. I'm just going to hand over now very, very briefly to James Abbott, who's president of the UK200 Group, to close the proceedings. James.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's James Abbott. Very proud to say that I'm president of UK200 Group. Well, what an hour, or 3/4 of an hour. I'd like to start by thanking James Bellini for chairing our panel and also our speakers, Yvette Cooper, Lucy Thomas, David Davis and Douglas Carswell. Thank you so much. And thank you also to your supporting teams as well. I know in the background they've been giving us lots of help. I think at this juncture it's important to remind ourselves why UK200 Group launched this campaign. It's the insight and strength of our relationships with our clients, or our members have with our clients, that led to this campaign for clarity. A campaign that raises awareness of the views, opinions and needs of SME businesses to enable them to make an informed decision on the 23rd of June. As James mentioned, we've already passed 30 key questions affecting SMEs to both sides of the referendum, and we're looking forward to working with both the Remain and Leave campaigns and publishing your responses. I also know that Declan and his team at UK200 HQ have done a lot of work in leading up to today. But they should be proud that our campaign absolutely will have a positive impact on SMEs, and frankly, that's what UK200 Group is all about. Thanks to Callum Morrison, Coventry University London campus, for the ideal setting for today's debate. You really have been perfect hosts. And of course the audience, not only those watching the debate by live streaming, but of course we're pleased to welcome you here today that have come along to London in person. Please stay for a drink as our special thank you to you. So finally, in maybe 42 days, we're going to make one of the most political decisions in a generation. I hope it's the right one. Thank you very much.